C11 is a surface mount aluminum electrolytic capacitor, and it's a pretty tough one to do because the entire contact is underneath the part. So I usually like to put a little bit of solder down on one pad and then bring the component in. I place the component on the soldered pad, and then using a large tipped soldering iron, I try and reheat the entire joint from the end. A little bit of flux probably would have helped here, but I think there was enough left over. I noticed that the part was rotated, so I went in with my fingers and gave it a bit of a twist. You can do this a couple of times. For the second component lead, I'm going to apply a little bit of flux to help with the heat transfer, and then I'm going to bring in the same fat-tipped soldering iron and try and heat up the pad and the component lead from one end while feeding in the solder. And if I get the component lead hot underneath, the solder should wick its way down underneath the part. So I did C11 first, because you really need to go in on an angle with the soldering iron to get that second pin. Let's move on to U10. You do the simple switcher like the other ICs. You solder down one pad first and then get the part positioned. Note that this part doesn't have a big circle down in the corner. However, it does have a tiny little white dot that you can see on the top of the package. So get the part positioned properly and then solder down one corner. Solder down the opposite corner and then go ahead and finish it off. Now this last component lead just doesn't seem to solder very well. It could be that the iron is oxidized or that the flux in the solder is getting a little bit old. So I'll have to go back and touch that up later. So the inductor is another tricky part because all of the component pads are underneath the body of the component and they're hidden once you put it on the circuit board. So you've got to put down a little bit of solder on one pad and tack down one side and then move to the other side. So this one is done pretty much like the capacitor is done. So there's not much of the pad to get at here with the iron, but I'm basically trying to heat up the pad and feed the solder in until it wicks underneath. And there we can see if the solder goes someplace, it's going underneath. And now the tantalum capacitor, little white dot on the circuit board on the right, that lines up with the bar on the capacitor. These are polarized capacitors, and they must be put in correctly. So line that dot up with that bar. So I played with it a little bit more, trying to get it perfect, which I don't think I did. But then I was able to go in and finally do the other side. So again, heat up the pad, try and feed solder into the joint. So let's put in D2 and D11. D11 is a transient protection device, so it does not need to be polarized. You can put that in either way. D2 is a diode, and it needs to be polarized. You need to line the bar up with the dot on the circuit board. And that pretty much covers the power supply. I think there's one more little capacitor in there and maybe a connector, but those are pretty easy.